So our next speaker, we're also very, very honored to have with us tonight, Nahla Abdo. Nahla is an Arab feminist, political activist, and professor of sociology at Carleton University. I feel like I missed something. She has extensive publications on women, racism, nationalism, and the state in the Middle East, with a special focus on political women.
Okay, I would like to begin with many thanks once again for the organizers for the great work that you guys did. I am very pleased to see all of you guys, and particularly friends and comrades with whom we had a long, many years actually, of work together. And these are particularly my Jewish comrades who are here, who we were struggling together since 1982, which means 3 years after I moved to Canada. So I'm so proud actually to see them here. Okay. After the thanks, actually, I would like to begin by basically begin with a small note saying that what we have been told by our media and officials that the whole situation in the Middle East is some sort of a conflict between Palestinians and Israelis because of Israeli occupation 1967. And when Mr. Kerry is going to solve it, that's it. The problem of the Palestinians will be solved. This is a lie, a big lie, and this is a total lack of understanding the history of Palestinians. It is not about 1967 and definitely not about what Kerry is doing with his Netanyahu. There is a context, there is a history that we need to know and understand in order for us to understand the struggle of Palestinian women, which is very much a feminist concern, and this is why it is part of, an important part actually, of International Women's Day. To do this context, I'm sure many of you know some of the details or some of that long history. But very briefly, and I will be pausing on certain periods that I feel are extremely important for us because they inform very much the types of struggle that Palestinian women have undergone. Okay, we know that the Zionist movement has started over 100 years ago, actually since the late 19th century, under the rubric of a Jewish national movement, whereas its actual implementation in Palestine meant that it was mainly and only a settler colonial movement. That movement actually, while it was implementing its plan, it started mainly as a strong movement, especially because, and not against, as we are told in our history books, because of the presence of British colonialism over Palestine. As you know, the first imperialist war, that is First World War, basically was for the splitting and division or dividing of many parts of the Third World. So Palestine became under the British and Lebanon became under the French and Syria became under the British again. And remember that the three of them, until then, until the First World War, were one country, and that country was called Greater Syria. And that division meant that the connection, economic connection and territorial connection, geographic connection between the three is gone, is not there anymore, which meant a lot in terms of the trade between these countries, in terms of family connections and relations. We are often told that the Zionists have bought the land from absentee landlords. Now these absentee landlords, many of whom actually came from Beirut or from Lebanon, they were not absentee because Palestine and Lebanon were, the same territorial continuity at the time. But they became absentee. They could not go back to Palestine and claim the land. And of course, the land was auctioned, and those who had more money could bid over the land, and the Zionists, believe me, they did have the money, and they did buy the land. It was not very expensive, but it was marketplace market value at the time, and this is part of it. The other part, which is extremely important, remember, it was during 1920 up to 1948 when Palestine was under British colonialism. British colonialism, the administration actually of the colonial rule needed money in order to pay for the administration, to pay for the IBC, which is the Iraqi Petroleum Company, that was supposed to bring petroleum to Britain, actually, to the empire, and Palestine was the venue for that. So to pay that, of course, taxes. Similarly to how the Harper government actually, how they build the infrastructure here, through our taxes. Taxes at the time had to be taken from Palestinians, over like 99% of whom lived off the land and on the land, that is largely as peasants. And the majority were not rich, they were largely working peasants, and paying taxes was an extreme toll on them. By 1930, reports came out already about the impoverishment, heavy impoverishment of Palestinians. Those who could not pay the taxes were imprisoned, and then their land would be once again auctioned, and the buyers would be agencies, Zionist agencies or Jewish agencies, such as the JNF, which is the Jewish National Fund, as well as the Jewish Agency, and then later the Histadrut. The Histadrut, remember, is the union in Israel, but don't be deceived. It's not the union that you are aware of. It is the capitalist union. That is the employer and the and the employees at the same time. And the whole idea was to build a national home for the Jews in Palestine, because they're, as the British did in Canada. That is, Canada was a land without people for people from all over the world. Palestine was looked at by the Zionists as a land without people for people without land. Whereas there was 1 million Palestinians living on the land and off the land at that time. So basically, their disposition from the land, their expulsion from the land, was one of the major policies, if you want, of the Zionists. Okay, one last thing about until 1948 is how did the Zionists build the settlements? Exactly the same as they are doing right now in the West Bank and Gaza. The notion that was presented at the time was called tower and stockade. That is basically in high places on top of hills to overlook whoever is there from the Palestinians, plus to be very close to the borders. That is, this kind of securitization of the mentality of the Israelis or of the Zionists has always been there and continues to be there until now. Now, all what we hear is that, poor Israel, little tiny country and surrounded by 23 Arab countries, regardless of where are these 23 Arab countries. But that notion of security was very much part of the entity of Zionism at the time. 1948, come the Nakba. Nakba is known by some as, like Iran Papi, for example, refers to it as ethnic cleansing. 80% of the Palestinians were literally forced out of their homes, out of their property, out of their land, and trucked. Like one of the guys, that is Rabin at the time, if you remember, Rabin who made peace with Arafat. Rabin was responsible as a general at the time of putting literally people on trucks and driving them outside of what was known at that time the borders of Palestine. Massacres took place during that time. butchering of women took place during that time, on top of the already impoverishment and imprisonment of many Palestinians. I thought I had a book. Thank you. In my recent book, actually, Women in Israel, where I also talk about different Jewish women in Israel and racism within Jewish women in Israel, Women in Israel, Race, Gender, and Citizenship, I have a quote about how one of the massacres were reported actually by a British officer who himself witnessed that massacre. And the massacre happened in a village that we probably have heard of, Deir Yassin. Okay, the following graphic description of the massacre, based largely on eyewitness accounts of the massacre reported by a British official and by Jacques Direnier of the International Committee of the Red Cross. It's a reminder of the deeply racist and hate-mongering attitude towards indigenous Arabs held by the Zionist settler movement in Palestine. The massacre at Deir Yassin took place on April 9, 1948. In total, some 250 people were shot dead and many more wounded. According to Martin, of the 250 killed, there were 25 pregnant women who were bayoneted in the abdomen while still alive. 52 children were maimed in front of their mothers, then slain and beheaded. Their mothers were in turn murdered. Their bodies and sexual organs subsequently mutilated. 60 other women and girls were also killed and mutilated. Quoting British Army officer Richard Carleton, who was present at the scene, Martin writes, "There is no doubt that many sexual atrocities, rape was quite ravaging there. Sexual atrocities were committed by the attacking Jews. Many young schoolgirls were raped and later slaughtered. Many infants were also butchered and killed. I also saw one old woman who had been severely beaten about the head with the rifle butts." It is interesting that if you look at some of the Ashkenazi, that is the white European Jewish women, they're known as Ashkenazi women, they talk about their settlement not as, they don't refer to themselves as settlers, but as pioneers. And the pioneers are only the whites. Actually, the majority of the Jews until 1990 were non-white Jews, non-Ashkenazi. They mainly came from Arab and Muslim countries. Nonetheless, Israel is seen largely as represented by the democracy of the white. Here is the last quote. Speaking about one of these Ashkenazi women, the pioneer. "The gang was young, men and women, armed to the teeth, and had also cutlasses in their hands, most of them still blood-stained. A beautiful young girl with criminal eyes showed me hers still dripping with blood. She displayed it like a trophy. This was the cleaning up team that was obviously performing its task very conscientiously." This is the Nakba of 1948, which stuck in the memory not only of individual Palestinians, but very much collectively, and has been very much alive in the struggle of Palestinians, and particularly women. I just finished a research actually on Palestinian women between 1960s and 80s who became political prisoners, and all of them were involved in the armed struggle, where the Nakba was the most vital reason for their joining the armed struggle there. Now, after 48, between 48 and 66, 20% of the Palestinians stayed in Palestine, in historic Palestine. These 20% were in three main areas. They were in the Galilee, in the Triangle, which is sort of the middle of Palestine, and in the south, in the Naqab or Negev area, the Bedouins. All three areas right now have shrunk tremendously. Palestinians right now are who make around 1.45 million people are living on only 3% of the land of historic Palestine. The rest is, state land and GNF land. So between 48 and 66, these Palestinians were living under military rule. They could not move from one city to another or from one village to the other without the permit or permission of the military ruler at the time. So they were totally cut from their families, their community. They were basically isolated in three major areas. We all know 1967. 1967 is the war of further expansionism of the Jewish state, as it calls itself, or of Israel as a settler colonial state. It continued settlerism to the rest of Palestine. The Palestine that included actually areas from Jordan, areas from Gaza, but it also expanded to other Arab countries, and until now it continues to occupy the Golan Heights, actually. That did not end at all. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon, as we all know, and this is the period and the struggle that we had in Toronto when we used to live in Toronto, actually, with the comrades that I mentioned at the beginning. This context is very important for me because it does periodize as well as enable the understanding of the different forms of struggle of Palestinians. Like colonialism, or as old as colonialism has been, women's struggle has also been there. Before the 1960s, actually, between 1920 and 1930s, we notice a movement of basically middle and upper middle class women who used to have sit-ins and demonstrations, mainly in cars, but also going with leaflets to the Mandub Islami, to the Higher Commissioner, British Higher Commissioner of Palestine, protesting against actually the Balfour Declaration. 1936, there was the first Palestinian revolution, 6 months of total strike, general strike, but also the armed struggle was going on. At that point, Palestinian women, peasants mainly, took a major part, and they carried weapons, they used weapons, but they also hid the revolutionaries, and they did all the work, including the supportive work. 1948, a total, if you want, splitting of Palestinians, total disarray, where 80% are out all over the place, and only 20% under colonial military rule. And people were just gathering themselves. The 20% of Palestinians who stayed in the land, in Palestine actually, had started a movement known as Al-Ard, namely the land, but all of them, of course, were captured, put in prison for many years, and the movement, which was called Al-Ard, the land, became underland, became an underground movement. The 1960s, where the PLO 64 began to form with the different factions, and women regenerated their own struggles, but both in the occupied territories of 1967, but also outside of Palestine in the refugee camps, particularly in Lebanon. 1960s until 1980s, women were heavily involved in the armed struggle. I took a particular interest in this period. Why? Partly because if you look around, you will find that most of the studies and work that have been done actually were around the Intifada, where probably most of us know a lot of work that has been done around that, because it was largely a massive movement of women and children and elderly and what have you. And the weapon that they used was the stone. So it became, the stone throwing intifada or uprising. I don't like the term uprising, but nonetheless, it's the translation literal translation of intifada. So I did not focus on that one. Instead, 1960s, 1980s. So partly, as I said, because of the armed struggle, which we don't know much about. The only thing we probably heard about it is earlier what we saw, Layla Khalid. Layla Khalid for the West was the terrorist. The terrorist because what she did basically, and she repeated that line so many times in the books, recent book about her by Sarah Irving, actually, fantastic book, but also in all of her interviews. All she wanted to do is send a message to the world that we exist, that as a people we exist. And of course she wanted to fly over a place called Haifa, the city of Haifa, because she comes from there. She was expelled with her family from Haifa, and her dream was to go back to Haifa. So she went back to Haifa basically through hijacking a plane at the time. Now, the other women that I spoke with, and I had tremendous, beautiful conversations with, there were 17 of probably hundreds of women between the 60s and 80s who were involved in the armed struggle in Palestine itself against Israeli military posts, different kinds of struggles, placing grenades here, placing grenades there, bombing this installation, that installation, etc., organizing, agitating, etc. So this is the kind of work that hundreds of women were involved in, but they're not recorded. History does not know much about them. Now, what made them take this step to begin with was the memory of the Nakba, but also the fact that the time, you all know, the time internationally, the spirit was a revolutionary spirit everywhere, in Algiers, in Latin America, and in Africa, and all kinds of places. Even in the United States, the Black and Hispanic movement actually in the 60s. So the international environment was very much right for them. But also internally, Palestinians have produced a culture of resistance, including resistance poetry as well as the prison poetry. And I would like to read to you very briefly a couple of poems from very famous poets about what resistance is. That is only if I can find it. It is somewhere. Okay, here I begin with Mahmoud Darwish. We are standing here. We're sitting here, always here, eternal here. We have only one goal, to be. After that, we differ on everything, on the shape of the national flag. We also differ on the words of our new national anthem. We also differ on women's responsibilities. About the latter, he adds, "You will do well, my people, if you choose a woman to head the national security." He has another poem, and that was towards the Israelis. "All those who pass between fleeting words, carry your names and be gone. Steal what you will from the blueness of the sea and the sand of memory. Understand that which you will never, namely, how a stone from our land builds the ceiling of our skies. As for us, we have to water the martyrs' flowers, live as we will, leave our country. You leave our country, leave everything, and leave the memories of memory." That also tells us the extent to which the memory is there, memory of Palestine. Tawfiq Zayyad, another I mean, both are comrades, by the way, members of the Israeli Communist Party. His poem, فلتسمع كل الدنيا, let the whole world hear. We shall never submit to the power, the phantom, the cannon. We shall starve, go naked, sliced into pieces, and we eat soil, but will never surrender. He continues his defiance by declaring that he shall write everywhere in Palestine that Palestine was occupied, it became free. And the occupier, the usurper, it became a memory. The warning is here. Okay, the personal and the public and the national were very much part of the memory of women during that time. They could not differentiate between the personal and the family and the national and the whole thing. And that is one of the dilemmas about feminism and nationalism, actually. The time itself, the period itself, tells us what exactly women in struggle feel in terms of their feminism. How do they see their feminism? How do they see themselves as women? One quote I have in the book that I'm writing is, if I don't do this, that is, if I didn't struggle, I would not call myself a woman or a Palestinian woman. Because look at where I am. I'm a refugee, I'm nowhere, and this is the only way I could salvage myself and my people. All the women I looked at, actually, or most of them, were from 1967, but there were also several women, including Zakiya Shamoud, as well as Therese Halassi, who were from Palestine 48. There were Muslims and Christians. All were in prison. Two of the women, one of them I shall say something about her actually on the poster, and one of them was Aisha. These women got repeated life sentences in prison. Rasmiya got 3 life sentences plus 10 years. I never understood why another 10 years. The other woman got 2 life sentences and 10 years. So there's something about Israel in terms of 10 years. I'm not sure exactly what. And the struggle outside of prison was very similar to the struggle inside the prison. Again, defiance and strength and resolution that we shall continue the struggle until we achieve our goals. The struggle continued. It did continue during the First Intifada. It continued during the Second Intifada, regardless what radical and liberal feminists all over the world, regardless how they wrote about them as terrorists, as they killed children. So it's fascinating how these individuals, these occupied, these oppressed, have become basically the villain as far as those who can talk are telling us. Whereas Israel, the terrorist, the apartheid regime, the settler colonial, was seen as poor little state that needed its security. But once again, the fight and the struggle will continue as long as there are Palestinian women and men alive there. Thank you very much.